On the 31st of October 2024, bioware released Dragon Age: The Veilguard for PlayStation 5, PC and Xbox Series. For many players, this moment was strange. For years, the community had been waiting for a very different game, one known under the working title of Dreadwolf. Controversy did not take long to appear. The game sold roughly 1.5 million copies in its first 2 months, falling well below EA's internal expectations of around 3 million units. Soon after release, information about the troubled development cycle began leaking. Reports described multiple redesigns, shifts in direction, and a dramatic pivot from a planned cooperative multiplayer experience to a single-player game following the commercial failure of Anthem. Combined with internal culture clashes and constant restructuring, the end result was a product that feels deeply confused about what it actually wanted to be. The reception reflected this almost immediately. At the time of writing, the game sits around 4.0 in user reviews on Metacritic, and one particular review summarizes the experience perfectly. And after forcing myself through the game, I can honestly say that I agree. Playing Veilguard felt like an endurance test, not because the game is challenging, but because nearly every system feels like it was designed in isolation, layered on top of one another without any coherent vision tying them together. The writing frequently collapses into awkward dialogue, the characters behave like mentally challenged teenagers masquerading as quirky adventurers, and the visual presentation is covered in aggressive coloring and shading that attempts to mask otherwise generic assets. The result is an abundance of abject mediocrity, shallow and generic systems, too little depth, boring and stereotypical UI, and a design philosophy that feels completely disconnected from what once made Dragon Age compelling. So if you want to reward the sheer willpower it took to push through this game, consider leaving a like, sharing the video and subscribing to the channel. My name is Henry Hoffman Myers, your Hex Grid scientist, and this is the final installment of the documentary Dragon Age Retrospective and Legacy. Enjoy! The game allows the player to select from 4 races: Elf, Qunari, Human and Dwarf. And immediately we run into a familiar problem: bioware's inability to maintain a consistent visual identity. Once again the races have been redesigned, once again the aesthetic has shifted, and once again the series moves further away from any stable visual continuity. Now, on its own, this might seem like a minor artistic decision. Games evolve, styles change, developers experiment. But when you zoom out and look at the series as a whole, a pattern starts to emerge. At this point, Dragon Age has produced 4 different interpretations of elves and 4 different interpretations of Qunari. Every new entry seems determined to reinvent them as if the previous game simply never existed. And this would be easier to forgive if BioWare had not already proven that they are capable of maintaining visual continuity. Look at Mass Effect. The Turians have looked essentially the same for nearly 20 years. Their anatomy, facial structure and armor silhouette remain the same across every title. Which means BioWare clearly understands how to preserve a coherent visual identity. They simply do not apply that same discipline here. So the problem is no longer artistic experimentation, the problem is inconsistency. But let's move on. As always, I decided to create an elven woman. In Dragon Age Origins, elves looked reasonably believable. In Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, they became extremely thin, almost skeletal. And now we arrive at the latest interpretation, the muscular lady, I guess. I spent 24 minutes adjusting sliders and trying different combinations in the hope that I could create a character that looked at least aesthetically coherent. The result? No matter what I did, the character creator kept producing variation of the same underlying template. And this is where a small irritation becomes a much larger design problem, because the game presents itself as offering deep customization. But in practice, the range of visual variation feels surprisingly narrow. The sliders suggest freedom, yet most of them operate inside a limited range of underlying facial structures. No matter how much you tweak them, the outcome tends to drift towards the same exaggerated proportions. Sharp jawlines, broad shoulders, a more rigid angular silhouette than the game seems willing to let you escape. At some point, the characters begin to resemble members of the Habsburg dynasty. Now, to be clear, this is not a complaint about women having strong features. The problem is that the character creator seems to converge towards those traits repeatedly, which reduces the sense of actual authorship on the player's side. That is the key issue here. A character creator exists to support player expression. If most combinations still return to the same aesthetic center of gravity, then the system is offering less freedom than it appears to. And I am clearly not the only one who noticed. Just look at these comments. And the deeper you explore the customization menu, the stranger things become. The game proudly allows you to add breast removal scars. Yes, I'm not kidding. Select pronouns and adjust gender identity settings. All of which, according to bioware themselves, have no meaningful impact on gameplay. But somehow the system struggles with something far simpler, allowing players to construct a face that looks natural within the game's own aesthetic framework. And then we arrive at this moment. I select female, I select she, her pronouns, for the love of God, I choose a female body type, and the character appears with visible shading on the jawline that strongly resembles shaving marks. That grey tint? That's post-shave stubble shadow. Whether that was intentional or not, the result is distracting. And while the game offers all these cosmetic options, it somehow forgot to include something far more important. There is no option to import your Inquisitor from the previous game. For a series built around long-term player choices, this omission is extraordinary. Apparently, the political outcome of the Mage-Templar conflict does not matter. Apparently, the fate of entire factions across Fedas does not matter either. What matters, apparently, is who the Inquisitor bedded. That says quite a lot about the priorities behind this design. By the time I finished wrestling with the character creator, the mood was already set. Within the first 30 minutes, the game had already crossed several major warning signs. So after 24 minutes of slider experimentation, I present you the result. Meet my protagonist. The last name is already filled in, although it hardly matters. Throughout the game, the character will be referred to almost exclusively by a gender-neutral nickname that perfectly summarizes the design philosophy of the entire project. Rook. And here lies the biggest problem. In this context, the character creator is a redundant system. If most characters ultimately converge towards the same template, then the system serves very little purpose. If this was the protagonist model BioWare wanted for the game, they could have simply presented it as a default character. Instead, the game spends the player's time simulating freedom. A good comparison would be Cassandra from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. She is a physically strong, imposing character, but she fits the narrative structure in which she exists. Her design is intentional and coherent. But imagine if Odyssey had a character creator and every possible customization still ended up looking like Cassandra. At that point, the system would be completely pointless. And that is exactly the situation we have here. I think the entire character creation experience can be summarized with the following meme.
Bitch, gon' step on my fucking toe, bitch, with them fucking cowgirl fucking boots, bitch, disgust.
At this point, I was hoping the gameplay system might redeem the experience. Unfortunately, things were only getting worse. The first thing you should notice about the combat system is that BioWare finally decided to abandon whatever hybrid experiment they attempted in Inquisition and moved towards full action combat. On paper, this is actually a good idea. The problem is that this shift required a long list of other mechanical changes in order to function, and many of those changes introduced new issues. From a purely technical standpoint, the combat is easy to explain. Hit detection is now collision based. When the hitbox of your weapon intersects with the hitbox of the enemy model, damage is applied. This is standard action RPG design. The attacks are directional, you actually have to aim towards the enemy. Defensive mechanics are equally straightforward. You can parry attacks by pressing the correct button when the halo indicator turns gold. Some attacks cannot be parried and must instead be dodged. Those are marked with a red halo. Mechanically speaking, this is a simple and highly functional structure. And I will admit something here, the animations are fantastic. The pirouettes, the jump attacks, they all look great. From a purely visual standpoint, the combat is impressive. What I do not like is the visual presentation. Everything is excessively colorful. Special attacks explode with neon effects that make the combat look like it came out of a children's coloring book. I have nothing against strong colors when they are used carefully, but here the effect becomes overwhelming. Instead of reinforcing clarity, the visual effects create noise. Now, the biggest structural change becomes obvious the moment you watch a few minutes of gameplay. The combat is now completely player-centric. The player character performs almost all meaningful actions while companions mainly provide assistance. This transition actually started in Inquisition, but here it is fully realized. This approach worked well in Mass Effect, where the player character can deal sustained bursts of damage with firearms while companions provide tactical support. But in a medieval fantasy setting, this shift produces a strange result. Companions are reduced to little more than spectators. You can press the tab key to open a menu that displays their special abilities, which you can trigger manually. From what I have seen, companions do not use these abilities autonomously, so the responsibility falls entirely to the player. This alone is already a major downgrade compared to earlier Dragon Age titles. In the previous games, companions were active participants in combat, each with their own resources, health bars and tactical roles. Here, you cannot control them, their equipment slots are extremely limited, they do not manage resources, they do not even have visible health bars. Which raises an obvious question. If companions barely participate in combat, why are they here at all? Their mechanical purpose is never clearly defined. The moment companions stop being independent actors, the system stops being a party RPG, it becomes a hero action system with support abilities. The combat loop becomes: the player attacks, the player dodges, the player triggers companion abilities, the player combos, repeat. This is a massive oversimplification because the engine no longer needs to simulate party AI, positioning systems, tactical pathfinding, party resources, and so on. You only balance one character, and in the process you remove much of what gave the series its identity. As a result, the entire combat system revolves almost exclusively around the player. Is that necessarily bad? Not quite, but the implementation introduces another problem. The combat feels strangely unresponsive. It looks spectacular, but the timing often feels slightly off. Parries require perfect timing, and the animation itself does not function as a sustained blocking state. It is a very short defensive window. Miss that window and you cannot simply hold the block button. There is a brief cooldown before you can attempt another parry. Enemies' attacks are also difficult to read. Many animations include delays, feints, or sudden speed changes. This might sound like a deliberate design, but in practice it often feels like a mismatch between the animation timing and the actual damage trigger. In other words, the visual cue and the mechanical hit do not always align perfectly. Abilities introduce another new system. Instead of consuming mana or stamina, abilities now use a resource called momentum. Momentum is generated by attacking enemies, dodging effectively, and avoiding damage. Once enough momentum is accumulated, the player can activate abilities. Conceptually, this is fine. It creates a rhythm of building resources and spending them. However, the ability system is extremely limited. The player can equip only 3 active abilities, 3 runes, and 1 ultimate ability. For a modern action RPG, this is a remarkably small toolkit. And when you combine that limitation with the lack of companion control, the result is a combat system with surprisingly little depth. It is shallow. In practice, most encounters devolve into a simple loop: attack, build momentum, trigger an ability, dodge incoming attacks, repeat. The game clearly attempts to borrow elements from Souls-style combat, particularly the emphasis on dodge timing and heavy enemy damage. but this introduces a fundamental problem. Souls games are built around extremely precise combat feedback. The timing of animation, hitboxes and player inputs must be nearly perfect. Here, the responsiveness simple is not consistent enough to support that style of combat. Parries feel unreliable, enemy attacks can be difficult to read, and the player is left leaning on dodge far more often than engaging with the parry system. Add potion usage on top of that and the combat often devolves into repetitive input loops with occasional ability triggers. Which is unfortunate because this type of action combat has been successfully implemented countless times. Nier Automata, Stellar Blade or even Darksiders 2 are perfect examples. Considering how many games have refined this formula, the roughness here is difficult to justify. BioWare also made a rather curious design decision regarding range combat. The bow is no longer a primary weapon, you can only carry 8 arrows, meaning you cannot realistically play as dedicated archer. The bow becomes a secondary tool rather than a viable combat style. At this point, BioWare might as well admit that designing ranger classes has never been one of their strengths. I'd go as far as to say that they are completely incompetent in this case. Character progression does exist, but it is hardly inspiring. Each class, warrior, mage and rogue, has 3 specializations, only one can be active at a time, and abilities are unlocked through a circular skill tree that vaguely resembles the upgrade system used in Final Fantasy. Unfortunately, most nodes in this structure are passive bonuses rather than meaningful new mechanics. The system looks large, but its actual impact on gameplay is minimal, and this brings us to the final problem. Combat is technically built around combo chains, but chaining these combos into meaningful damage bursts is difficult when the combat itself lacks responsiveness. There is a clear structure revolving around primers and detonators, for example freeze an enemy and deal heavy damage to shatter that enemy. This mechanic existed before, but here it becomes one of the core principles. The enemy encounter design is once again structured around the concept of arena combat, similarly to Dragon Age 2. You have a group of small enemies led by an elite and you have to beat them while avoiding environmental hazards. This doesn't quite work, the result is a system that looks complex on paper but feels shallow in practice. Flashy animations, bright effects, lots of visual noise but very little mechanical depth. In the end, the combat feels like all shine and no substance. And perhaps the most worrying part is that BioWare already solved many of these problems years ago in other games, which makes this outcome impossible to explain. Because when a system fails this badly, the issue is rarely ambition. The issue is design discipline, and here that discipline appears to be completely absent. One of the first things that struck me when I started playing this game was a very simple question. Why is there a strange filter over the entire screen? Most modern games apply a global color grading, a lookup table, to the final image. In simple terms, it is a cinematic filter applied over the scene that has been rendered. I'm sure you have seen this many times before. Fallout 3 is notoriously known for its green color grading. Fallout New Vegas pushed in the opposite direction with its dusty orange tint. And Deus Ex Human Revolution became infamous for its golden filter that made everything look like it had been dipped in mustard. When used correctly, color grading creates a consistent visual tone. When used poorly, you get Veilguard. The game uses a heavy purple/magenta grading that appears across a large portion of the environment. Combined with extremely stylized materials and glossy textures, it produces a serious tonal mismatch. It feels like someone tried to force-feed me a cake with far too much icing. Pink, dense icing. The result is strangely childish. Now, the assets themselves are not necessarily bad, many of them are technically detailed and competently modeled. But once you combine them with this aggressive color grading, the entire presentation starts to resemble something closer to an animated children's movie than a dark fantasy RPG. For the first 10 hours, I genuinely felt like I was watching a DreamWorks cartoon, and this is where the real problem begins. Because this aesthetic direction feels like a complete misinterpretation of what players actually wanted from Dragon Age. I'm not here to play some modern version of the Shrek 2 video game. Dragon Age used to present itself as a serious fantasy setting, It knew when to be humorous and when to be dramatic. The tone had some sort of balance. Here everything feels exaggerated, oversaturated and oddly playful. Even the ability icons reflect this problem. They are extremely stylized, overly clean and aggressively colorful. Every element of the interface seems designed to grab your attention using the brightest colors possible. The purple tint returns again in the level up screen. Necrosis abilities glow in an almost radioactive green. At some point it becomes difficult to understand the design reasoning behind this palette. Now I want to be very clear about something. I'm not accusing BioWare of using generative AI in the creation of this game. There is no evidence for that. But there is something about the visual presentation that strongly reminds me of AI generated imagery. The assets look strangely full. There is an unusual amount of mesh density and material depth in many models. Faces appear inflated, surfaces feel excessively smooth and facial structures sometimes lose their natural proportions. Take a look at this monster's face. What exactly is happening here? Why do the cheekbones look like that? Why does the entire structure appear swollen? The face has that same inflated quality often seen in AI generated images. When the algorithm struggles to interpret facial depth, it looks bloated. Once again, I'm not claiming AI was used, but either BioWare took visual inspiration from that aesthetic or this is one of the strangest coincidences in modern game art direction. To illustrate what I mean, let's compare Bellara's face with something else. Take Hotel Transylvania 3 for example. See that exaggerated fullness in the facial shapes, that rounded inflated cartoon geometry. That is exactly the effect I'm talking about, but there is an important difference. Hotel Transylvania is an animated comedy film. Dragon Age is supposed to be a dark fantasy RPG. Bellara's design ends up sitting awkwardly between those two worlds and the result is deeply unsettling. Her facial animation borders on uncanny, the textures feel overly polished and the proportions often look unnatural. And this same problem spreads across the entire visual design of the game. The colors are exaggerated, the materials are glossy, the characters often look like they belong in a completely different genre. At times, the aesthetic starts to resemble something closer to children's animation than to serious fantasy setting. Now, let's compare this with Dragon Age Origins. Origins used a desaturated color palette. Muddy browns, dark steel greys, muted greens. Low saturation combined with strong contrast created a sense of gritty realism. The armor looked worn, the walls looked dirty, the world felt cold and hostile. Characters stood out because of lighting and contrast, not because everything was painted with neon colors. By comparison, environments in Veilguard sometimes look more like stylized promotional imagery than grounded fantasy spaces. The strange inflated look of Veilguard's characters isn't necessarily bad modeling, it's likely the result of modern rendering techniques like subsurface scattering and soft global illumination being pushed way too far. These effects soften shadows and diffuse skin lighting, which removes facial definition and makes characters appear rounder and more artificial. Why someone thought this was the right artistic direction for Dragon Age is honestly beyond my understanding, and BioWare didn't stop there. They applied the same visual treatment to Harding, a character who previously looked perfectly fine in Dragon Age Inquisition. Exploration often feels less like an RPG and more like a simplified puzzle game. The puzzles are not difficult, they are simply repetitive and poorly designed. They interrupt the flow of gameplay without offering meaningful challenges, and the game seems determined to congratulate you every time you complete one. It constantly feels like the game is patting you on the head and saying, "Good job, you are very smart," which might work if the audience were 6 years old. But when a studio asks €60 for a game, the least it can do is treat the player like a grown-up adult. Instead, Veilguard often feels like a parody of a fantasy RPG, a product that mistakes bright colors and exaggerated presentation for charm, and ends up delivering something far closer to visual noise than artistic direction. I played Veilguard for the first time. Under normal circumstances, I probably would not have ever stooped so low, but I did it for this series. and in a way I can say that I had already played it before. Because the overall design of the UI and multiple supporting system is probably one of the most stereotypical and overfamiliar combination I have seen in the past couple of years. What do I mean by that? Let's look at the inventory and equipment screen. Squares, lots of squares, placed in a certain order. The inventory? More squares. Where have I seen this before? Ah, yes, Assassin's Creed Origins, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Hogwarts Legacy, Bloodlines 2 and many others. Look carefully at these pictures. Do you notice? It's the same system with the same visual logic. This is what I would call console-first UI design. It is built primarily for controllers, console navigation and large icon readability, not for PC interface dev. This grid tile inventory has become a de facto AAA standard in the last 10 years. It appears in many games because it scales well across controllers, televisions and simplified menu structures. For me, this design approach has become a red flag of overly standardized AAA UI. It is efficient, it is readable, and it is almost entirely devoid of personality. If you want counterexamples, Rogue Trader, Pillars of Eternity, Metro Exodus, and others. You can still build interfaces with actual identity. Also, look at how armor behaves in this game. It doesn't fit tightly on the character model, it often looks as if the character is wearing baggy clothes, as though something underneath is pushing the armor outward. I have seen this in both Hogwarts Legacy and Bloodlines 2. It creates an awkward silhouette and does the design no favors. More importantly, the beautiful and satisfying crafting system from Inquisition is gone.
It is what it is. Life is not fair, într-adevăr. It's gone.
Instead, we get a stereotypical upgrade system, bring the materials, press a button and that is it. Even the use of a simplified plus to signify weapon improvement feels like a generic shortcut. This type of system initially became common in highly grind-oriented RPG design, where raw stats mattered more than visual identity. It is an efficient way to quantify power without having to visually represent progression through new models. That approach makes sense in systems built around repetition and long upgrade chains. But why is it here in a large AAA Western RPG? It is a surprisingly unambitious design choice. It works in games like Dark Souls because there, a weapon is more than its visual depiction. It has specific range, weight, movesets and unique combat value. But here the combat itself is already so limited that item design needed to carry far more of the burden. Instead, the game opts for the most standardized solution available. There is also another borrowed system, increasing reputation through trade. Where have I seen that recently? Rogue Trader. By selling items to faction vendors, you increase their trading power. And on top of that, you are also expected to upgrade the store itself by bringing substantial amounts of resources. Once again, the game introduces a system that is functional but so familiar and so stripped of identity that it feels imported rather than designed. If I had to summarize the overall impression in one word, it would be derivative. For a game with this budget, this much time in development and this much franchise history behind it, the level of standardization on display is deeply disappointing. From my perspective, this is one of BioWare's least distinctive projects, and in design terms, possibly one of its most disappointing since Andromeda. After looking at the character creation, the combat system and the visual direction and the supporting mechanics, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Dragon Age the Veilguard constantly looks more sophisticated than it actually is. The character creator promises freedom yet produces the same narrow range of results. The combat imitates modern action RPGs yet lacks the responsiveness that makes those systems work. The party system still exists, yet companions have been reduced to little more than support tools. Again and again the game adopts structures that worked in other titles but rarely implements them with the level of care required for them to function properly. The result is a game that feels assembled from familiar industry templates rather than built around a clear design philosophy. And that is perhaps the most disappointing part, because Dragon Age once had some sort of identity. The Veilguard doesn't just move away from that identity, it struggles to replace it with something equally coherent. This was the last part of my documentary series Dragon Age Retrospective and Legacy. You can watch all individual parts on my YouTube channel Hexgrid Scientist. Soon enough, a complete version of the documentary will be released, containing every episode plus a couple more chapters regarding Dragon Age as a series. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, share and subscribe, and turn on the notification to be announced when the full documentary will drop. I am Henry Hoffman Myers and I wish you a beautiful day.